Hey guys, how's it going? Today I'm going to show you how to draw a fur texture. So things you're going to need are a 2H pencil. You're also going to need an HB pencil, which is the same as a number 2 pencil. You're going to need a 2B and a 4B. If you have more, of course, you're welcome to use them. These are just the basics I'm using. I'm also using a kneaded eraser and a Q-tip if you've got one, if you're somebody who likes to blend your pencil. So the first thing I like to do, and this is pretty reminiscent of when we did the metal and glass, is to lay down a base layer of value, so just a light gray midtone here. Now I'm following the direction of the fur as I see it in the reference picture, so I'm noticing that on the left side, the fur is all sort of moving straight up. So I'm just using my pencil, flowing it in the same direction that the hair is moving. And then I'm noticing that as the fur moves over to the right side, it sort of curls off a little bit. So I'm just emulating that with my pencil lines. You'll also notice that I'm not drawing in a zigzag pattern with my pencil. I'm doing all of my pencil strokes in a single direction, up or curling off to the side, not going back and forth with my pencil. This will help give you a better base texture for your fur as you continue to develop it further. So once I've got a pretty even gray coat here, I'm going to actually go in with my HB pencil and darken up some of these areas that I see that are a little tiny bit darker. So you might notice that the right side of the image is a little bit darker where there's some shadow, and then that bottom is a lot darker at the base of the fur there. So I'm actually just going to lay in some darker values just in preparation for that. These early values, these early shadows that I'm creating will help us later down the road. So putting aside the HB, I'm going to go into the 2B now and just keep doing what I'm doing. I'm still building up some darker areas. This pencil is going to be a good deal darker than the HB. And just as a reminder, make sure that you never press too hard with your pencil. If you need something to be darker, you can always use a higher number B. If you press too hard with your pencil, it'll be it'll be harder to get off if you need to erase it, but also it'll make the graphite kind of shiny on your paper, which I don't personally like the way that looks. You might like that though. But it will leave indents in the paper and it will be harder to erase. So especially in these early stages, you want to be very, very careful not to press too hard. Use a very gentle touch. So I'm just going to continue darkening those areas that I see darker. We're not going to go completely as dark as I see it there in the picture just yet, but again, this is sort of a roadmap to help us figure out where things are in the reference photo. And lastly, I'm going with my 4B and just adding a few more shadows in that really dark area. Now, if you're somebody who likes to blend their pencil, which I don't blame you, it looks good when you first do it, I want to get you guys away from blending with your fingers. If you can use a cotton swab, that's a better thing to use if you absolutely must blend your pencil together, and it does look good when you're doing fur. The reason why I'll tell you not to use your fingers ever is because your fingers will leave grease on the paper. Even if you have the cleanest fingers ever, it'll leave some oils, which will discolor the paper after a while. But it'll also tend to make your graphite look a little bit blotchy, and it'll make it really hard to erase if you need to erase something. So if you feel really, really compelled to blend, you can use a blending stick if you have one, although you need to make sure that you're using that carefully because that can make things streaky as well. Or you can just use a cotton swab, just a little Q-tip. The only thing to remember is that you got to make sure that you're flowing the Q-tip with the direction of your lines, with the direction of the fur. So now I'm going to take my 2B pencil and I'm going to start defining this fur pattern. This is where the biggest tip that I can give you comes in. Instead of drawing the chunks of fur, draw the shadows instead. look for the shapes of the shadows, and they're not very solid shapes. They're pretty fuzzy because they are shadows after all. They have some gradient to them. Look for where those shadows are and do your very best to place them where you see them in the reference photo. It's okay if it's not 100% perfect where you place the shadows. What matters is the gradient of it. Does it blend into the rest of the gray that you have on the paper? And does it make sense where you place them? I'm just kind of pointing out which ones I'm drawing here and there so that you can kind of get a feel for what I'm doing. And this is something that's very tricky to get used to. We're so used to drawing outlines around everything. But if you do that with fur, keep in mind that things in real life don't have outlines. We see things in value, in shadows and highlights that help to define the forms. So try to get used to drawing shadows and highlights instead. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm sometimes very, very lightly tracing outlines around the shadows to figure out where they should go, or I'm just using my pencil, following the fur direction, making sure that the values conform to the contours of the fur and the direction that they're going. And I'm just very, very lightly starting to build these up. And they're not perfect. As I'm doing this, I get pretty frustrated a lot because it has been a while since I've done a fur demo or a fur drawing in general. And how it works in my brain doesn't exactly make sense for how I explain it sometimes, but I think the biggest tip I can give you is just draw the shadows and just do your best to place them where you see them in the reference photo. So that's just what I'm doing here. I'm sort of laying out where they all go. And this process requires a lot of patience and it takes time. So be patient with yourself. Something I try to remind you of often is that art needs to go through puberty before it looks good. It will have its glow up, but it is not right now. So just trust in the process. It will come together. Now, as you're working here and there, if you want to take your Q-tip and sort of blend some of these shadows into the light gray that you have, that's totally fine. You can sort of work on one small area at a time, or you can work on the whole area. The one big tip I can give you is just don't let your wheels spin in the mud in one spot. If you get frustrated with one spot, move on to a different one, and then you can come back to it. It's okay to take breaks while you're doing this, and you're probably going to need to at some point. But you're welcome to blend things here and there, and that will kind of give you a little bit of a break. And then you can just get back into it. This is, like I said, a very long process, and it takes a lot of patience. I'm still using the same pencil. I'm using my 2B pencil here. Once you're done laying out all of those, once you're done mapping out all of those shadows, then we'll go back in with a darker pencil in just a moment. But it can be helpful to just sort of learn to enjoy this process, and depending on your perspective and your attitude about it, it can be kind of meditative to just sort of play this little game where you're sort of putting a puzzle together, looking back and forth constantly between your drawing and your reference photo and thinking, what little things can I add? What little moments have I missed, and where can I add them in to make it even stronger? So after what may feel like a very, very long time, I'm going to finally take my 4B pencil and start to darken up some of these areas. Now, I'm not completely covering up all of the shadows that I already have with my 2B pencil. That would be a waste of doing all that with the 2B pencil. I'm just looking for how can I create those gradients that I'm seeing. The shadows and the highlights here are not just black and white. There are so many different midtones full of dark grays, light grays, medium grays. I want you to look really closely for where you see value changes. Where do you see the value scale happening? Where do you see the really, really dark areas? And you can go in there and darken those up. I'm going into that really dark spot right in there and just sort of defining, again, still following the direction of the fur pattern and just defining some of those shadowy, furry areas. And then I'm going to come into some of those less dark areas, but still dark, and start to define those more. So usually you're going to see the really, really dark areas are going to be right next to the really, really bright areas. That's because those really light areas, the spots that look white on my paper, those are the pieces of fur that are overlapping the fur that's behind it. So that overlap is causing a shadow to be cast upon that fur in those really deep areas. So I'm kind of coming in here and showing that depth. It really helps to make the fur look high relief, like it's raised off of the surface. Those white spots of the fur, those white streaks that we're seeing, those are the highest points. They come the furthest off of the surface, so they get the most light. And the darker areas are the areas that get the least light. So it's just something to keep in mind. We're not just putting down dark shadows and highlights anywhere. It really has a lot to do with creating the illusion of form and depth. This is also a good time to take this pencil and start to kind of fuzz out some of these light areas that you have. So you don't want the white areas to be really, really chunky. So I'm kind of coming in here and sort of carving in a way into the light areas so that they have a little bit more of a fur texture. So I'm sort of doing that here and there, just trying to keep those white ends a little bit wispier because we don't want chunky furs. It's okay if we have locks of fur that are very clear, but we also want them to be piecey at the ends, if that makes sense. So I think this is a pretty good point where I'm going to actually take a moment to stop and actually grab my kneaded eraser because we're starting to lose our highlighted area. So I'm just going to do a quick blend, and then we're going to take our eraser and start to pull out some of these highlights. So we have some pretty good highlights right now, however, we need some brighter ones. So take your eraser, give it a little bit of a stretch, and then form it into a little bit of a point. And then we're still flowing with the direction of the fur. Don't just rub your eraser in any old direction. You want to make sure that it's going with the fur. And you want to re-establish the point on the eraser often because it'll get blunt after you use it a couple of times. So I'll usually do a little swipe with my eraser. I'll reform it with my fingers. I'll do a couple more little swipes here. I'll reform it, do some swipes. And I'm, again, constantly looking back and forth between my drawing and the photograph to see if there's any highlights that need to be redefined. Because a few of them are getting lost in here from all of the pencil and all of the blending. It's easy to lose some things. And remember that your eraser is just as much of a drawing tool. In fact, it's a terrific drawing tool, just as much as your pencil is. So use that to your advantage. Come in here and redefine some of those lighter areas. Imagine that you're drawing little strokes of fur, little strands of fur, with these strokes of your eraser. And if you have a good sense of control over your eraser, you can make some really great little flyaway hairs and things like that if you can get the erased lines to be thin enough. It takes practice, but it's a really, really strong technique to use. So now that I've got some of my highlights redefined, I'm actually going to come back in here with my 4B pencil and start to redarken some of my shadows. It can be good to take a break to add some highlights here and there, and then you can sort of come back and say, where do things still need to be a little bit darker? Where can I define some more things? You might realize that you completely missed a really, really dark shadow, and you need to go back and add it. That's absolutely fine. That's part of the process, sort of stopping, taking breaks, working on another area, and coming back to it. And again, I'm still coming in here and trying to break up some of these highlighty areas to get them to look like little strands of fur, putting a few really light pencil lines in between them here and there, sort of carving into the white surface to get those ends to be a little bit more fuzzy. You may also decide that you want to blend a little bit more with your Q-tip. One piece of advice I can give you about blending in this late stage is that it'll make your highlights a little bit less bright because you're pushing graphite onto them, so it's always a good idea after you blend to just go back over with your eraser and re-pull out some of those highlights. So you'll see me doing that in just a moment. But pretty much here I'm just adding a few finishing touches, darkening some things up where they need to be darker, defining a few strands of hair, sort of chunking it a little bit more, just some final touches. So I'd say that this is pretty much done. I'm just kind of cleaning some more things up with my eraser. I feel like once you can figure out how to draw hair using this technique, you can pretty much draw any texture. So instead of thinking of things as being outlined, think about the shadows and the highlights instead. Break those down into basic shapes. Do your best to place them where you see them in your reference photo, and then just keep building up the gradients of value. However you see those qualities in your reference, just try to imitate them in your drawing. So we're pretty much done here. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you next time.